Welcome back, Rhetoric Warriors podcast. We are here to add some talk sophistication, think sophistication to the world so that you can handle some of the stuff that's coming avalanching down the political mountains these days. And it's a lot. I'm Dr. Dan, rhetoric PhD, escaped professor turned comedy writer, live in LA, founder of Rhetoric Warriors, and the soon to be developed, hopefully to launch this in 2023, the Ethical Persuasion Institute, where I do some type of activism and education in a more organized way than just the podcast and the book. On the podcast, I talk to comedians about their careers and their politics. I need to do some more of that. I got a lot of friends out here. I convert conservatives because the right worries me. I think they can use some conversion, bring them back to the fold. And I talk to people who study this stuff and are actively in the world of persuasion and social issues, education. More rhetoricians on this podcast than any other podcast you'll listen to today. This is my second time with my guest today. Super smart, super fun. She's a professor and Admiral James B. Stockdale Chair. Sounds good, like when you're the chair of a James D. B. Yeah. Professional military ethics at the Naval War College. Let's get her on here. Dr. Pauline Shanks Kaurin.
Thank you. And just the usual disclaimer that I'm here in my personal capacity and not representing the Naval War College, the Department of Defense, or the Department of the Navy. But thank you for having me back. Evidently, you didn't learn your lesson the first time. So let's see if we can sort that out.
Philosophy is a bigger area than you might, right? Like it's endless. It's just same with rhetoric. It just encompasses everything.
Keeps going.
Yeah. So your area of expertise, one of your many areas of expertise. I looked through your blog again today. So many cool articles and posts in there. Everybody should go check that out. Especially the one with the bibliography you're building for all the different levels of
yeah.
Very useful. But violence, and you can't have the military without violence, right?
Right.
So we've got that one setting there, and now we have politics coming up, which seems to be more and more, sort of suggesting this civil war, this, January 6th, like there's political violence gurgling. So it's a topic we need to talk about.
Yeah, and I taught classes on terrorism. I also taught a class toward the end of my tenure at Pacific Lutheran University to undergrads just on political violence, and it was very early 2018. So that was an interesting class, sort of reflecting back on the 2016 presidential election. But I'm also from Montana, where we have lots of militias and white supremacist groups. The Unabomber was hanging out there in Lincoln for a while in a cabin, the Freemen in Jordan, Montana. So political violence is something I've been interested in, both from the perspective of war, but then also sort of social and political philosophy, and when is political violence justified? Is it ever justified? And we talk about these issues, especially January 6th, the War College, because now the military is sort of getting caught in the middle of some of these things, and has some members who a minority, obviously, but who espouse various political beliefs, some of which involve violence against certain populations. So this is an issue. It's something that we have to think about. So
you cannot divorce humanity from violence, right? I mean, my side of the world in rhetoric is in some ways you can define it as a form of sort of cognitive or linguistic violence, and that you're trying actively, at least assertiveness, you're assertively trying to bring people from one place to another. So you don't shrink away from the active engagement with the other. Now, when you move that over into, like, I guess we're going to have to do the rhetoric thing to start with. Like, how do you move that over into something that becomes defined as violence versus assertive influence? What is the line that turns it into violence?
Yeah, I guess it depends. Then this is the War College philosopher answer. I guess it depends how you define violence. So there are some people who would argue that certain forms of speech, like hate speech, for example, or speech that denigrates or humiliates or dehumanizes or so on, that those kinds of speech are actually a kind of violence. So there's that position. So it depends. You mean that, or do we usually think of like physical kinetic violence, like I'm, going to like punch someone or shoot someone or try to kill someone or assault someone. Um, so I think the where one becomes the other, like the physical violence is pretty easy to see, right? We know what physical violence looks like. January 6th, lots of physical violence going on. Some of the other stuff it's harder to see is a threat to lynch someone, and you have a crowd assembled where it's an imminent threat. Is that a kind of violence? And and since you're in rhetoric, I'm really interested in what people think the link is between rhetoric and violence. So someone like John Stuart Mill, who wrote a famous book called On Liberty in the 19th Century, says, listen, the government should not limit freedom of speech except to prevent imminent physical harm to someone else. That's the only reason the government should intervene. Now, individual citizens can do other things like refuse to talk to people and stuff. But the government should not intervene except to prevent physical violence. And his view was that if you let people spew, if you let them say their stop, that it was kind of a release valve, and you'd be less likely to have physical violence if people could sort of go off about whatever they wanted to go off on. And then other people would say, no, that's wrong. And so he, I think, viewed this in terms of what we call the marketplace of ideas. But I know when I've taught Mill the last couple of years at the War College, and even before that, students are pretty skeptical about that argument and wondered, like, how does social media change that? Because now anybody can go off and millions of people can be influenced by what they say, as opposed to like when I was growing up. Like if I went down to the corner and went off, like maybe there's 5 or 6 people, most of whom were related to me, who might hear that. But there was a pretty limited, there's a pretty limited scope and influence. So I'm curious about what you see as the link between does rhetoric lead to violence? And especially there's an argument in genocide and Holocaust studies, right? That that genocidal behavior starts with dehumanizing language and certain kinds of rhetoric and referring to people as subhuman or as animals or as insects. And it's that language that starts to set the mindset that then allows it to be easier to engage in physical violence later on. So that would be my question for you. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, yeah, I
Question.
think, it's the classic binary answer, that the safe binary answer of both are absolute truths, right?
Right,
Staying in dialogue with people tends to humanize them,
right,
and you learn their perspective. The closer you get, especially if you're doing deep change on difficult topics, a lot of times it's about praxis and direct experience with that population. Like you can talk forever, but you can't get change unless you can get them actually in deep interaction over time. And then
right.
they can understand these are human beings. There's no way to deny that because they've talked so much, right? They've communicated so much. Versus over here, this kind of planned, unethical rhetoric, authoritarian rhetoric, triggering rhetoric, even media, which is designed to heighten
Right.
emotions and situations, it clearly does that. It clearly can take people up to the point where they can no longer process down here in like the real experience of a community. It becomes this fantasy, and once it gets up into there in the sort of big good evil terms, then of course you've got more justification, for violent moral action. So it's both, and I think social media it's far more over here, right? It's far
The
more.
far is a higher, even though, so like what you're talking about is when you're in dialogue, like philosophical or other kind of dialogue with someone, especially over a period of time, that's kind of one thing. And that can happen on social media. And that we've had, a few cases of where people have really been persuaded to a different view through their sustained interaction with someone else on social media, right? But most of social media is sort of putting the blast out or consuming things where it's not you and I having a conversation. It's me and my followers. Like, I sick my followers on you, and it's abusive. It's not dialogue. I'm not interested in your arguments. It's sort of insulting and bullying and all those kinds of things, which that seems to remove actually people from each other. So it depersonalizes it in a way. I think that makes, and I think you have to, for most humans, you have to depersonalize before you can engage in violence, usually, right? Not always. I mean, intimate partner violence is different, sort of honor violence is different. But for most people, like, they won't just kill somebody that they see at the grocery store. Like, some stuff has to happen. And what you're talking about, the, like, me turning you into a non-human, or you are evil, and evil has a lot of power because evil should be eradicated. You don't have a discussion with evil, right? You don't come to compromise with evil, which is, I think American politics has always had some of this because of our religious roots. So, like, our rhetoric has never been like sunshine and roses. Look at the presidential election of 1800 if you want some fun, interesting insults. It was pretty nasty. But I think when the times when that evil discourse comes up, it makes it impossible to compromise, and then it makes it easier to do things that you can't. They're harder to take back, right? They're harder to reconcile afterwards, right? And that's what we see as a precursor to genocidal behavior. We see that kind of language about evil, or dehumanizing language, or lots of language around, like, this is an infestation. And so, of course, you wouldn't, like, have a dialogue with insects.
Sure.
You get rid of the infestation
with great vehemence. Yeah.
Right.
You can kill, like, there's nothing, more vehement than killing a fly you haven't been able to catch for 20 minutes. I think back to, like, Bush on 9/11, the sort of reactivity to evil, like when it gets lifted up into story and narrative, right? When it's pure narrativity, and you need good and evil, you need villains and heroes and narratives. And him walking out, with the bullhorn, people will pay for this. We're the best murdering machine that's ever been, and we're going to murder you so hard for what you've just done.
Toby Keith, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, which came out right after that. I listen to country music, not my favorite song, but it did, unlike some other hokey country music songs from the time. Like, I think that song resonated, especially it was very popular with military audiences. He would go and play it for military audiences, especially in Afghanistan and later in Iraq, which, well, that's another problem, right? But I think it captured something, right? It captured that visceral, like, that reaction, that Bush on the, on the pile saying, we're coming to get you. And it captured that kind of, spirit. And then, the axis of evil speech, later on, then kind of framed that narrative. It wasn't just that we were attacked, right? It's that there's this evil plot, right? It's not just about 9/11. Now it becomes about Iraq and about, North Korea and so on. And so once you start framing things in that way, I don't think it's that violence is inevitable, but I think it makes it much easier, much more likely, or in the case of warfare, allows people to justify it in their own mind. See, we're the good guys, right? We're Toby Keith, like, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue is the name of the song. So it's the flag, and if the video is just like over the top, and it's got the eagle, and it's the whole, we're gonna come literally give you a black eye. right, are the words. I mean, this is a really it's not subtle. Like
Right.
it's really in your face, but it really like resonated. And it's not like my favorite song, but it is my favorite 9/11 song because it's authentic in that way. And it frames the narrative very clearly, I think. And it captured that moment. Right. Whereas the Alan Jackson song, like "Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning" or whatever, like it was a nice song, but it didn't really like capture it in the same like kind of visceral kind of way that the Toby Keith song
Well, I think that's what
did.
things like country music are so good at, this kind of fantasy, like keeping violence and keeping retribution and revenge in a fantasy narrative world. Versus, I remember during First Desert Storm, the first images before they decided, oh, hey, we've got to really clamp down
On the media, yeah.
of this imagery, because I remember the picture of like they just bulldozed over top pillbox or bunker or whatever, and it was just Iraqi arms sticking up
Yep.
out of the sand. And they're like if you allow that stuff to take things out of the fantasy over into the documentary, it completely changed the type of narrative that you're putting out in the world. And you talk about rhetorical reactivity, that second type of thing of seeing graphic human death, people can't take that at all. Like they're not even close to being able to take that. They can't even take that with animals.
So then how does that, because I think we've seen more of that with the conflict in Ukraine, right? We've seen some pretty like graphic stuff that's sort of more like, and I agree with you because that was part of the issue with Vietnam is people were seeing these really graphic pictures, especially the pictures like from Eli or the Napalm Girl. Like we're seeing these really, really graphic pictures. And there was some of that in World War II, especially in the Pacific theater. So maybe there was a different narrative, but I think in Vietnam you saw those kinds of images. So I'm interested in, even though we're more of a proxy in that in the conflict, we're supporting Ukraine, about the effects of those kinds of pictures or the chemical attack pictures from Syria in like was that 2013, 2014. So I'm wondering, because you're right, with the first Gulf War, they were very careful after that, because I was watching on TV. I was a college student at the time, working the night shift to pay for college. And after that, like the narrative, the pictures were it was a very well produced war.
Right.
I will say, right? And so I'm wondering if, how the narrative framing, or how from a rhetorician's perspective, things change when we're not the major combatants, right? When like with Syria or Ukraine, or even with Vietnam, we were a combatant, but it was supporting allies. Wondering if do you think that shifts things?
Yeah, clearly it goes back to your point about what human beings need to be able to do to perpetrate violence, or to allow violence, not to intercede with violence, is to keep it as an abstraction.
Right.
As soon as it becomes visceral and personal and immediate, and empathetic, like you can't not empathize, then people start to step in. It's like the pictures of the students dead at Kent State.
Right.
It was a perfect shot because you also had the reaction shot of the friend to tell
Yeah.
you exactly how, just powerful this loss was and how wrong. And so for a rhetorician, those type of super penetrative images soaked in emotion, especially the graphic ones, are going to, rise up all those emotions, and they're going to be incredibly powerful in those situations. So if you're on the other side, you got to keep those out, as much as you can.
Right. Unless they're, so when I taught political violence, when I teach war, we do a lot of movies, we do a lot of film. And so I think unless that is a part of a larger narrative arc where good guys, bad guys, and then there's resolution at the end of 90 minutes and the hero gets the girl, and it reinforces all our notions of masculinity and triumphalism and American exceptionalism. I mean, pick any action movie like the Rambo movies, all of those kinds of things. Like there's a pattern to all of those. So I think when those really nasty things are embedded there as the here's why Mel Gibson like goes off the deep end and starts going after these
Sure.
people, right? When it's embedded there, then somehow it's like palatable and acceptable. But when it's that Kent State moment, or the My Lai pictures, or that picture, some of the pictures that come out after the first Gulf War, right, that were censored at the time, and they're really, I mean, they're just visceral, gut-wrenching pictures. I think that it humanizes things and makes things complicated in a way that we don't like. At least I don't. At least my sense is Americans do not like complicated narratives. We like very simple, straightforward, like good guy, bad guys, the Western, kind of narrative, right? So when things start to get messy and fuzzy, like then people are like, well, I don't know. Well, who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Like, are we the baddies? Right.
Yeah. Well, I just watched season 4 of The Handmaid's Tale, and they ran into that problem in season 4. She had largely escaped the forces of massive evil that had dominated her and destroyed her in many ways. And now she had some efficacy against them, and she was being just as violent, if not more, and
right.
had completely lost her humanity. And so it was hard to root for her. No matter what she had been traumatized by, you're kind of like, yeah, I get it, but
there's a line there, right? That doesn't fit with our narrative. Yeah.
So from a philosophy standpoint, like when you bring these things up, I guess you've got the population of the military and then the students. Like what's the difference when you try to teach these things into the military? Like, do you have an agenda, the philosopher that you'd like for people to land up, or are you just trying to teach them the skills, the tools?
Well, it depends on the course. So we have a core course called Leadership in the Profession of Arms, which is a leadership and ethics course, and that's very much about just sort of getting them to think about their own leadership. I teach courses in just war. I teach a moral philosophy course. Right now I'm teaching a moral and ethical failure course. So in those other courses, it's more about sort of the specific content, which is sometimes more philosophical. So then it's about getting them to think about their own philosophical and ethical commitments. But one of the challenges in talking about political violence in the military is that we have this sort of civilian military relationship where we expect the military to be, quote unquote, apolitical. But all of your listeners who have read my book know that I think that apolitical stuff's a bunch of BS. And what Huntington should have said, Samuel Huntington, is that what we want is a nonpartisan military, right? Because the military is a political actor that they act as the agent of the state. So by definition, they're political actors. But what we want is a nonpartisan military. And so I think there's a great sensitivity to talking about anything that seems like political or partisan, which something like January 6th definitely was, or any of these kinds of issues can be. And so I think the first thing is just to get people comfortable. I know people don't like the term safe space, but I think that's really important to create a rhetorical space where people can examine ideas, can examine their own ideas, can ask questions, can push back, can share arguments, can say, I'm really uncomfortable right now, examine assumptions, which I spend a lot of time hammering home, so much so that my students get really sick of it. What I think a lot of people, you can't examine what you can't find. And so the first task is to help them find, what are your assumptions? Like, where is this stuff kind of coming from? So I don't know that I have a particular place that I want to get them to be, but it's more of getting them to really dig deep and examine their assumptions and to think about what commitments they have, especially for those people who are members of the military. Some of our students are civilians or from other government agencies, plus we have international students from all over the world. So wherever people are coming from, to think about what are the obligations of their profession that they've chosen. These are mid-career people mostly. And to think about those assumptions and to think about where their lines are. You know, so January 6th was a difficult thing for us to talk about, right? It's still a difficult thing to talk about, even a couple of years later, as people are trying to, you know, process these things and figure out what their obligations are. The COVID vaccines have been big discussions. That's not necessarily a political violence question, but that's a question around, you know, what are your obligations to obedience? Which does get to, is there ever a
Right.
time when, you know, as a member of the military, you could use force against your own citizens, or you would, you know, rebel against your own government, those kinds of questions. We don't spend a lot of time on those questions. But I mean, they're also part of American history. We began with a nonviolent rebellion to start with, and then it turned into a violent rebellion. So we were literally birthed, you know, out of political violence. So when people say, well, this isn't America, I'm like, where have you been? Right? Yes, it is. I mean, we could talk about whether the founding fathers were justified, which actions were justified. But, you know, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, which was nonviolent, at least on one side, was met with violence on the other side. And there were, you know, groups and people who advocated for violence. Thought Martin Luther King Jr. thought the nonviolent approach was not the way to go, right? So this business of political violence is something that is really deep in the American philosophical sort of political tradition, which isn't to say, like, I think it's fabulous, we should all be violent all the time, but this question of where the line is has always been with us.
Yeah, and I think that fluidity, you know, of where it lands to start the discussion on each side and figuring out where everybody is on that line. Like the idea of political nonviolence is a rhetorical move. I mean, it's
Right.
political obstructionism, right? Like it's
Right.
within the world of politics, it is a violent, aggressive political move to just, we are not going to agree, even though like the laws are this way and everything's set up, we're just not going to do that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's been turned around now by the right, and then the right is going, oh, hey, we can use
We
that
get to.
too. You know, like the semis showing up in Canada, and you know,
Right.
all these very traditional kind of civil righty, you know, techniques and tactics, and they're like, oh yeah, we'll just use that too. And you know, obstructionism is clearly, I mean, it's somewhere on that fluid line of violence.
Because it's I mean, if we think of that as a kind of resistance, right? And whether it's Martin Luther King or Gandhi, right, where you're putting your body or your follower sort of in the path of whatever power is involved, right? And it's a resistance, it's a pushback. And I think, yeah, you're right. I think the line about, so that question that we started with about what's the definition of violence, I think is a really important question. Because if we think about violence as something that has the effect of causing harm, physical or otherwise, clearly physical violence causes harm, but I would argue there are forms of rhetorical violence or obstructionism or resistance that also cause harm. And we know from intimate partner violence, it doesn't have to be physical to be abuse, right? So this question of what constitutes violence, and is it harm, or is it certain kinds of harm that we want to say would constitute violence? Because if I hurt your feelings, is that violence? If you say, wow, that shirt, Pauline, that you're wearing, I don't know what's going on with that, I'd be like, yeah, I just kind of pulled it out of the drawer, and I'm not in love with it either. But that's different than saying I think your child is like a reprobate and is going to be a juvenile delinquent, he's going to prison. That's a different kind. Like, I would consider that more in the realm of violence, and that probably would be met, because I'm sort of the mama grizzly bear type, that probably would be met with violence if you insulted my child, right?
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
think this question about that, you know, I don't think it's a binary. I do think it's a continuum, and it's hard to suss out, like, where are the lines, where are the demarcations.
well, and you see, you know, one of the big rhetorical moves that's happening now and this is sort of described in postmodernism and late modernism of appropriation,
Right.
where you don't have to have the roots of a rhetoric in order to use that rhetoric. And
Right.
so you see this with violence, like the whole terminology of microaggressions. That's essentially saying you are doing something that I'm pulling this term aggression out, and I'm going to use it over here, as a way of labeling your behavior to villainize your behavior a little more than it's been villainized. It used to be hurt my feelings, or that's rude, or whatever. Now it's a microaggression. And if you can get terms like that to stick, they'll do work for you.
Right.
But it's a question of, once you try to start doing that in sort of an artificial way, it gets kind of awkward. And this is what happens where it blows back against like the progressive left about woke and all these terms that they've introduced that are lampoonable, and you can turn that back around on them rhetorically fairly easily, because you can see that they just grabbed that term in an artificial way.
Right. Or just take a term like critical race theory and then say, well, this is anything I don't like about a racial conversation. So yeah, so my question is, like, how do you respond to that if people are, so say I'm from a certain religious tradition, someone sort of takes a term, or I'm a feminist, and they take a term, you take it out of the context in which it emerges and has meaning, because woke has a particular meaning, especially within an African American cultural context, right? Religious context, right? So what's the response when your adversary rhetorically does that to you? Like, how do you, like, I think the response has been, here, let me explain the historical context or the philosophical whatever behind that. And that hasn't worked, right? Because they're using that term pejoratively or in a mocking way, or deliberately sort of representing, now making that term mean something else other than what it originally sort of meant. Sort of like when teenagers take a word that we all like, and that now it has a new meaning. I can't think of one right now, so I'm not that hip and try not to speak to my teenager. But like, when you take a term from one context and move it to another and appropriate it, like, what's the response to that?
Well, as you're talking about this, I realized like one of the reasons why I named my book 21 Colosseums of Persuasion is because the Colosseum is a theater of battle.
That's right. Yeah.
It's made
Gladiator.
for violence, right? And essentially what happens in that situation, I talk about, Aristotle's definition is basically, a rhetorician needs to be able to see the whole menu, every possible option, and choose the right one.
Right.
So I try to lay out the whole menu in there. And like a lot of times when people ask me things like that, like what rhetorical work can you do to grab that back, or what happens when that in that definitional, fluidity situation, the right tends to do ethos work on terms. They just slander them.
Right.
They use them pejoratively. They don't do logos work at all. Whereas
Right.
the left will come back up and go, but that's not the definition, which is all logos work. And I'm like, you're in the
Right.
wrong Coliseum. Like,
Right.
you need to go back over here and valorize CRT if you're going to, fight that war over that term. And it has to be done very specifically, because they have it's a very clean agenda to stain something. Out of all the things that percolate,
Right.
one will
It's
suddenly
to
get
slur it. It's
stainable.
to say this is now an insult. So woke is now an insult, right? Or, whatever the, feminine, oh, you're a feminist, like that's an
Right.
insult, right? Even though sure,
Why not? Yeah, of course.
that's an accurate description of my philosophical worldview, and your point is what. But yeah, I think yeah, they are are engaged in it, and maybe that's part of our, not the problem, but the feature of our discourse right now, is that we're actually engaged in different discourses at the same time. We're not actually like talking to each other. I don't know that we're talking past each other, but we're engaged in different language games, is what Wittgenstein would call it.
Yeah.
Right.
I call it rhetoric storms. It's just different rhetoric storms coming at each other. If you don't match their storm, you're never going to get into their head. You're never going to get into their herd and make any progress. So
does that make violence more likely? Because if I see that my rhetoric is not, I'm not able to engage, I'm not able to persuade my colleagues to take my definition of this word seriously, or say, okay, I am a feminist, let's talk about what that means and what you disagree with me on. If that person is just not willing to engage, does that make violence more likely?
Well, again, I think that's one of the reasons I like rhetoric so much, is that the menu never ends. Like
Okay.
violence down here, physical. So like in the world of influence, here's like the options, but you still have to put physical control and physical attack somewhere in that world, because
Right.
it is inextricable from super frustration, or not being able to have any efficacy in a situation where suddenly, like you see all these movies about the righteous, like the dad who shoots the convict who molested his daughter because he can't
Right. You can't do anything else, right?
can't
Everything
do
else has
anything. The word
failed.
systems, the institutions are failing. So at some point, violence is always hovering right here in these discussions. So I think it is one of those things that, as long as it's an option, as opposed to something that gets locked out, as I don't care how frustrated you get, we will never sanction violence here. Like
Yes.
you go back to country music, one of my favorite songs is Before He Cheats.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Violence against the guy's truck. It's like, oh
Right. I'm gonna
man,
take
don't go
out
against the guy's truck.
like that's cold in country music. Like I have a truck. I'm from Montana. That is cold. Like maybe violence against his dog or his horse is worse, but the truck is like it's a
Right.
really
I mean,
serious.
it was an automotive boiling of a bunny, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Rip
That's
this
a good.
guy's.
So in just war theory, when we're thinking about political violence in the context of warfare, we would normally say, listen, violence, warfare needs to be a last resort. You need to have tried other things first. You have to have a just cause. You have to fulfill certain criteria. It has to be a public act, all of these kinds of things. But this idea of last resort, and also you have to have a reasonable chance of success, which I think our current sort of political discourse, I've been thinking about whether it was the attack on the FBI office, I think that was in Ohio, or January 6th, or these other or mass shootings. I do wonder about, so very often it does seem like to the people perpetrating them, this is last resort, right? But I also wonder about reasonable chance of success, because one of the criteria is supposed to be reasonable chance of success. Now we can have a talk with Vladimir Putin about how he calculated that there was a reasonable chance of success in Ukraine, but that's a different problem. But I wonder, in terms of this political violence that we see, whether that's mass shootings, which seem to me often are a form of political violence, or January 6th, or these attacks like against the FBI. I wonder if people are does reasonable chance of success matter at that point? Is that just, I've run out of options, it doesn't matter if I succeed or not?
I think again, it's that oscillating definition of success, right? I had
Okay.
a guy on here a couple of weeks ago who had published a blog post in 2018 called "I Was Almost a School Shooter."
Okay.
And he was talking about the psychological experience of growing up in a horrific environment and going down so far where the only thing he could see to do was basically go out in a blaze of proof, like, you think I'm this bad, I'm going to show you how bad I can be.
Right.
So his criteria of success wasn't to overcome the enemy. It was a bigger sense of identity, and fighting back against this invisible enemy of repressive culture that doesn't see him and things like that. So I think that the success button moves around a lot in that definition.
Yeah, and I think when we see like incel violence, right, against women in particular, that success seems to be, I want attention, I want to prove that these women were wrong about me, and I want to visit harm on these women. So success, so the extent to which you've killed or hurt people is success in itself. And then you add the identity piece to it, which I think is increasingly, my sense is that's increasingly more and more salient as a part of success, right? That I am showing because I think so many people, despite, this is really weird because we all have social media, we all have video, we can TikTok and show everyone the most intimate details of our life, whether they want to see it or not, right? And yet we don't feel seen and we don't feel heard. And so some of these actions are clearly when I was dealing with toddlers, we would call this attention-seeking behavior, right?
Sure.
You're throwing a tantrum in the middle of the floor because you didn't get your way, is what is what that is. Or my teenager slamming his door when he's mad at me, right? It's attention-seeking behavior because I don't feel seen and heard, which I think for some people means I'm not validated. You don't approve of me. You don't like me. So it's not just being seen and heard. It's being seen and heard in the sense of validation and adulation and fame, and you think I'm wonderful, right? So I think, it strikes me that identity piece maybe is a bigger piece of the political violence issue than maybe it has been in the past.
Well, I think, the social media stuff, you see a lot of social media is this weird mix of public and private, right? Like it's never been close to being this available to everybody to have access to a public character, a public space. Yeah. And the challenge becomes everybody starts entering that space, and now it becomes competitive again for like who can actually get any attention. Even the 4th of July shooter in Illinois, he had posted tons of videos of himself. He had tried to be an influencer in this space and got nothing, got no response at all. And so I think that sense of disempowerment, that can lead to violence, this idea of I'm so disempowered, I've got to do something extreme, and buying a gun and committing a high profile act of violence is going to rocket you up into the social consciousness without a doubt.
How do we sort out the role that capitalism has in that, right? Because the social media platforms, it is about getting likes and getting attention, but then there's also money that comes from that. The reason why I just saw some statistics about 1 in 4 Gen Zers wants to be a social media influencer, and I'm like, of course they do, because that's how you make money, right? Sure. It's a good, they probably make more than I do. So that's like, I should mention that to my teenager and say, maybe this would be a good job prospect for you. So I wonder about the intersection, because there's sort of the intangible incentives, right, of getting attention and getting fame and getting likes and that, but that's tied to monetary money and sort of capitalistic considerations too.
Well, the guy who wore the bison head, on January 6th was an actor, right? And he got more attention from that. I don't think he monetized it. Maybe he did. But he got more attention from that participating in that overall violence, and being prepared for it as a performer, like an influencer. Like he knew, like, I need a real costume. That guy was an actor, and he had the everything.
He worked it too. Like it was a whole vibe, right? And so it was a convincing, interesting performance that becomes part of the narrative, right?
Well, and he gets swept up into the villain narrative. Was he really a villain? He was an actor. Did he really do anything violent other than walk in there amongst all the other violence? And so like you get this weird kind of, is this actual violence, versus faux violence, like you're talking about in the movies and things like that, where you get this satisfying conclusion, because we not only kill, like on Handmaid's Tale, they killed one of the main characters at the end of season 4, one of the main villains. And it was like all the handmaids sort of, it was this very stylistic way of killing him out in the woods, and like 20 women just pounding on him. But they didn't show it. They didn't show him the way they usually do. If a man kills a man, they'll show like the, all
blood
the
spurting,
body parts, everything.
Yeah.
But they didn't show it, which is typically what they do in the movies. They don't show direct female, hyperviolence against
Right.
females, and apparently not so much by
By
females.
females. Right. Yeah, so I wonder about the role of intent here, because I was thinking about the guy who testified in the January 6th hearings, and he was from Ohio or wherever, and like all of us like watching that guy, like we all know somebody like that, right? Especially those of us who grew up in the Midwest, right? We all like he's in our family somewhere. And it was just interesting, like it's not like some people, like the Oath Keeper people, clearly set out to engage in violence, and they had a plan and they had resources and they were ready to go. But it seems like other people got swept up in it, and it was almost like sort of cosplaying, right?
Yep.
It was just like you're at a one of those conventions, and this is just like a fun thing you're doing for the weekend with the guys or the girls, and um like somewhat performance, somewhat karaoke, somewhat I don't know, like Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, those kinds of things. Right. Just struck me in that way. And then they got sort of caught up and actually with real violence. And then sort of when people started being held to account, and you could hear it in this guy's testimony, like he almost seemed shocked that he got in trouble for this, right? Uh, which I think to some degree, maybe it speaks to, impunity and privilege, but it also maybe just speaks to that at least some of the people didn't have the intent to violence or hadn't conceptualized it in that way. When Trump says, let's march, let's go to the Capitol, I'm going to be with you. Like, did they see that? Did they think, okay, we're going to go be violent? Or did they think, listen, we're just going to go support the president? And they maybe hadn't thought through like what was actually going to happen when they got there, right? Because I wonder about that, because it seems like there's different, like there were clearly people who were locked and loaded and prepared for what we think of as straightforward political violence, rebellion, warfare, the whole thing. But then it seemed like there were other people that were like, some of them were there for the party, some of them were there because they were expressing their political frustration that the election didn't turn out for their guy in the way that they hoped that it would. Some of them were there out of loyalty to Trump and the sort of cult of personality stuff. So seems like there's a lot of different things going on, and intent gets murky, I think, really fast. Like,
Right. Well, as per always in these complex environments, there are multiple motives. Like this is one of the
right,
things rhetoric likes to play with. What is the motive? What is the actual words, that used? How do you work between those two things? And I think it's interesting, like January 6th becomes, in the January 6th hearings, they have to amplify the villainy. They have to
right,
amplify the violence, and they've shown time-lapse photo,
yeah,
video, and they've done anything they can to amplify, bring in the victims, direct victims of the violence of the police officers, and have them
right,
testify and show the things that have happened to them, because they've got to keep that high. They've got to keep that this was a massively violent event, and because so few people, died, like within the context of how many people were actually there and what was happening,
yeah, yeah,
that it's not violent enough for that argument on that side of the rhetoric. And on the other side, it's these people were just wandering into the Capitol to have a discussion
hanging
about
out.
ballots.
It was a party. Like they just, they were pub crawling,
they got a
and they ended
little
up in the cap,
excited.
and they ended up. Yeah, so I think that's interesting. The commission, the January 6th commission, I think has been really interesting because they clearly, like, in terms of rhetoric, I mean, this is clearly like a made for TV thing, and people are talking about it in terms of like what's going to happen next season, which is not usually how people talk about congressional hearings.
Right.
And so that's been really interesting. I expected them to be quite boring, like congressional hearings usually are, which I enjoy, like, because I do my grading or other things while I'm watching them. But it was especially Ms. Hutchinson, her testimony, like it was riveting. Like it was like watching like Days of Our Lives or Perry Mason or something. And I know all that was very, very kind of intentional, right? Because of what the narrative arc of what they're trying to do. But you're right. There's a sense in which, although there's a sense in which the violence is part of the narrative, but that's actually not the most. That's not in the narrative. That's not the most shocking thing, right? So they have to figure out how do you portray the thing that's the most shocking to an audience that's used to visual violence, is accustomed to visual violence, and that's the shock factor. And how do you get people's attention when someone's just like sitting there in a suit and testifying? So that's a really interesting sort of rhetorical performance problem, which I mean, it was, some of the hearings were quite compelling TV, I will say.
Yeah, violence is definitely a strong political football. Like if you can label your other side with it, and it's violence against the wrong people, then you get a lot of traction. Versus violence against the right people, you get a lot of traction. So this idea that we're sending, Biden is sending these advanced weapons kind of on the down low, Reagan, esque, to Ukraine, who's the good guy in this fight, and therefore, Russia hasn't had the success that it's supposed to have had there because of this, kind of below the table amping of their violent capacity, because they're the good guys in this. And so the more we supply them, the better we are as a country. Even though maybe we're leading to that, Russia to up its game to the point where they're really going to destroy Ukraine instead of do what they would have done, which is maybe kill off some areas and then get the
annex. Annex part of it. Yeah, that was an interesting, speaking of rhetoric, that was an interesting sort of lead up, because I was at a military ethics conference actually the week before the invasion, or a few days. I walk into my hotel room after giving my paper talking about my book, and walked in there, and the Chiron is like, Putin's invaded. And I was like, and everyone was talking about it beforehand, and I was getting ready to teach when I got back, to start teaching strategy and policy, which is one of our core courses at the War College. And really didn't need another case study, but it was one of those things where I was like, no, he didn't invade, because that's like so very like 20th century. We don't do that anymore. And so that the rhetoric and the framing of all of that, especially leading up, and then when he actually did invade, it was like, oh, okay, what do we do now? Because like that's not the narrative that we had set up. We had this set up as this like, was this negotiating ploy and chess move. And as a just war theorist, I was like, nah, he's manipulating. This is a chess move. He's never gonna do this. I'm standing there looking at the TV going, dang, okay. So what do I do with my military ethics class that I have to teach, and my strategy and policy class, where we actually had and knew we were going to have a student from Ukraine in the class, right? So that's you have to rethink the approach to things. But yeah, so that was very interesting. It was also interesting watching the media have to, like, after the narrative sort of had been set and all the pundits had been saying this, and then all of a sudden, like, things are rolling and people are like, ooh,
real violence. Look at that.
Oh, so we have to, like, and it was just interesting having to watch, all of the media outlets try to, like, so what do you do rhetorically when, like, the facts in your face all of a sudden don't fit the narrative that you've, like, set up? And I remember watching on 9/11, watching that second plane go into the building, going, this is not happening. No, this is not happening. This can't be happening, right?
Right.
Even though, like, I remember the prior terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, years earlier, and Oklahoma City. So it's not like we didn't have stuff like this happening. But I just remember looking at the second plane, going, this can't be happening. Like, this is a movie. Like, what is this, right? And as a young military ethicist, I was like, oh boy, like, what? Yeah. So for me, that's sort of an interesting thing to think about.
It's this weird, it speaks to this weird core confusion rhetorically that we all deal with these days of growing up in the simulacrum culture, right? We're used to things being brought to us in a simulated fashion. And when reality comes, we think they're based in reality. There's some version of reality that they capture and they're bringing to us. But then you see reality invade what the structure that they've just created. I think
Yeah.
it's like the slap at the Oscars, with Chris Rock,
Oh, yeah, that was something,
which to
right?
me was such a fascinating moment because you're seeing this interplay of entertainment and reality,
Yeah.
reality journalism TV that we've never had before. It's gotten way more complex. And Trump, rode in on those twin surfboards of the confusion inside of that. And people are still confused. They still deem him a hero, even though in reality world, he's done none of the things that would, deserve the accolade of hero. He's got way
Right.
more failure than he has success. And Americans would never say a failure is going to be that kind of hero. But there's this core confusion, and like that moment when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock, a billion people went, "Is that a bit?"
I thought it was because I was, and someone sent me the video. They're like, "Did you just see this?" And I thought it was a bit. Yeah, I thought it was part of the act or part of like a joke or something. And then and then you started replaying it. I was like, I think he was so. Did he actually just? And that's not something, at least, and they did talk a lot about different sort of cultural context, but unless you hang out in, bars on a Friday night in Montana, you're not we don't see people just walk up and slap other people, right? That's not something that most Americans have as a part of their experience, except as a part of entertainment. So our narrative was like, well, okay, this has to be part of the bit. Right, because it can't be the real thing. And besides, this is the Oscars, and everyone's dressed up, and presumably,
The elite of the elite,
people behave
right?
themselves like
Sure.
you're on TV. Your
They're in
mom's watching
tuxedos.
this,
They can't possibly be animalistic, you know.
right? Yeah. So, like, if it was Friday night at the J Bar T in Great Falls, Montana, and the Cowboys are drunk, we might say, "Oh, yeah, like, okay, that could happen," but that's not what you expect to see when you turn on the Oscars.
Yeah, so it
So,
was this weird royal of reality and entertainment and confusion, and trying to find some location to go. How do I interpret this? And how bad was this? And he hit him really hard. I
he
mean,
did.
it was real
Yeah, it was
violent.
and Chris was like, you could tell he was rocked back. Is part of that, I wonder, with Trump, because he was a reality star. Like, so he was this kind of 80s icon, but he was like a kitschy 80s icon. I remember because
Yeah.
I lived in the 80s. And then he becomes this reality star. And then when he's like running for president, I just wonder if we've become so accustomed to reality TV shows that sometimes we can't tell the difference. Like, I think people just thought he was running as a ploy, and then when he's actually elected, people were like, "Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah,
Does
it's
that
that same
happen?"
core confusion. And you pointed to the January 6th hearings being produced by television
Right,
producers. So
right.
there's actual drama in there. There's pluckable moments that can be
Mm-hmm.
reused in social media, like the Josh Hawley running, video, which is such a beautiful troll
It
moment.
was lovely.
You know? But all that,
Yeah.
yeah, all that's designed out for that simulated medium so that it can
Right.
depopulate through the whole ecology. But Trump, he was the first person to come in and use reality plot lines in
Right.
politics, like straight up just attack 3 or 4 different people like every day and
Yeah.
never let it settle, never go
Yeah.
back to it. It doesn't matter. As soon as it loses energy, pick somebody else. And if you watch the Real Housewives or whatever, they have running feuds, but they
Oh
also
yeah.
have like they're just rude to everybody. It's just all over the place. And that reality show plot line of I just need to cause trouble, has been the macro technique for Trump all along. I think when you run it, I always said what was going to be interesting to me because like fascism 2.0 essentially hides the no bodies on the ground. Like to me, the only real difference between fascism 1.0 and 2.0 right now is that they're not leaving bodies. They're using rubber bullets instead of real bullets. So you're not seeing that kind of visceral, effects of the violence that they're doing. go after BLM and go after these, what they would want to use as villain moments of the
Right.
left. But as soon as they stop dropping bodies, then the whole thing changes. The narrative changes, and they work really hard not to do that.
Yeah, because that produces a particular effect when that starts to happen. And as long as that's back to the threshold of violence, right? And what kind of will we tolerate? So we are acclimated to reality TV. So I think we are used to this constant like shock factor, and not just reality TV, but like the, Jerry Springer and all those like talk shows and TV shows where people are working out their family problems on TV and all of that. So I think we're acclimated to that constant churn, that constant drama to a certain extent, but not when someone punches someone else who's in a tuxedo or, wants it. I mean, I do like, there was something about January 6th because it was in the middle of COVID. And I'd been teaching my leadership and profession of arms class that morning, and had come off Zoom and had come into the living room, and I'd left the TV on, and I got a text from my other son who's on the West Coast, and he's like, "Mom, are you watching this on TV?" And I was like, "Oh, I just walked in." He's like, "What's going on?" He's like, "You're the professor. You explain this to me." And I'm like, "I don't know what's going on. What the heck is going on? It looks like they're like storming the Capitol. What is this, Bastille Day or something?" Like, it just was one of those things where you're like, weird. Like, what is this? Like, and you're sitting down watching this, and we're all watching this together going, what the heck is going on? And so that was one of those moments too, because it was that reality, sort of coming into what like didn't seem to fit.
Well,
right?
and
It
you
didn't
go
seem
back,
to fit.
you pull in things like, and this is a little more abstract for Americans, even though they got to hear the audio and things like that. But the Khashoggi, murder,
Okay, yeah.
and the fact that we were kind of involved in that, right? He was was he a naturalized citizen here? Can't remember.
I forget, but I mean, he worked for the Washington Post,
Right.
right?
So I don't remember if he was a naturalized citizen or not, but it was close to being an American, what somebody could see as a full American,
Right.
being murdered by a foreign entity that just didn't like his what he was saying.
Reporting, yeah.
And we got to hear a little bit of that audio, and Trump literally going his final response of, "Hey, it's a bad world out there, a lot of bad people." Like, and that just tied it off. And you're like, that's enough for us to see a murder out in the open and move it over into, well, that's just part of doing business.
Shit happens.
That's amazing that you can say that, and get away with it as a rhetorical strategy.
So as a rhetorician, what did you think of the impact of the video of George Floyd being murdered? Because that's not like, we've seen stuff kind of like that before, but maybe not that graphically. Or I just think that was an interesting it was a weird moment in my house because one of my sons is African American, so that was a whole different conversation, right? But that was interesting that moment seemed to like, it kind of reminded me of the Rodney King beating in the 90s, right? Except I think it had a much more, I mean, that had a galvanizing effect too, but like this was like, it had a particular effect that the things like that had happened before, I mean, didn't seem to have quite the same effect, unless you think about like Ferguson. But
yeah, I mean, that fully raw, high def, almost choreographed to the and just the time spent watching this happen. It wasn't like a punch. The thing, Arkansas police came out last week.
Yeah.
The police are always getting these, and it looks horrible. And violence like that is constantly available now. You've seen the verbal violence, like the Karens going off with full racism, blaring and things like that. But that video was so high def and so long, and you watch the guy die underneath this guy's leg. There's never been anything like that as far as a rhetorical artifact that I know of.
Yeah, I think it was the time, and I think it was Dave Chappelle, his routine afterwards, where he was just talking about like that the time becomes this sort of emblematic thing. And in several of the services, they talked about the time, and so that was an interesting piece. But you're right, yeah, for that kind of a thing, it was long, right? And it was, yeah, and the high def and I think for many people not from a marginalized community. Like this may have, I mean, they may have seen these short videos on the news before, but this seemed to be a different kind of thing. And that, like, what got me is that he was calling for his mother, right? And I was, as a mom, that just got me.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that was a really interesting moment. And I think the context of the pandemic too, probably because we were all stuck at home, right? We're mostly stuck at home. We were in a different space than, we weren't going to work. We weren't doing on vacation, doing the things that we would have been doing.
Yeah, and on my side of the world, it's always the sort of agnostic rhetorician looking for assets. What does this message or this symbol or this video do for my side? How does it hurt the other side? How do I respond if it's hurting me on my side? And you see things like this in the sort of vegan wars with what essentially are horror films
Yeah,
of people, of animals being murdered, and
right.
they shoot them like horror films. The bodies flop, blood splatters, and all these things where that type of visceral use of video and death and this kind of sort of bland cruelty that people have about, they don't even care. It's just another
Right.
dead thing that they're processing, and those are hard to overcome, rhetorically. I think what happens typically is that the more you see that, it's somehow the human response to start to find a way to compartmentalize it, move it down in the emotional order so that you're not constantly feeling this massive triggering. And
Right.
so, people try to get away from it. They stop watching that stuff as much. I would bet even with the Ukraine stuff, people are not watching that hardly at all anymore.
No, and I think originally, like, sort of people were riveted, and maybe not in a. And I know, like, a week into the war, people were like, "Okay, what's going to happen next?" Like it was like they were watching a TV show, and it was like, y'all, this is like the real thing. And so that just kind of struck me about how acclimated we are because of reality TV and because of social media and popular media. We're so acclimated to things getting sorted out in a half an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours max, and a certain kind of narrative arc and all this kind of thing. And so when something disrupts that expectation, then that has then that's interesting. I think we struggle to kind of deal with that, which I think has been part of 20 years of conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, Americans don't have that kind of attention span. We didn't with Vietnam either, right? So it's like, how do you keep the
Well,
focus, and how do you keep people's attention when you're dealing with things like that over that period of time?
this is also part of your issues. Like there's just so much violence in the world. If you start
Yeah,
going poaching it from its different locations, like you said, all the way down into relationships, parental violence, school violence, it's so permeated that people, again, like no matter what you use, if you overuse rhetorical assets, it's going to start lose power.
yeah.
It's got trigger power, but then it becomes exhaustion, and people just have to stay away from you. I'm curious, like when you do this in your classes, is there a sense of, I mean, must be hard to teach within the context of you're teaching people who are essentially being trained how to do violence well, and they're supposed to make good choices about it. It's supposed to have its borders and parameters. But do you feel like, and is it a neutered space as an academic or an educator where you're like, again, like I'm just trying to get you guys into this space where you can be critical about all this? Or is it like you said, feminist and mom and things like that? When you bring in artifacts to talk about, do you take a position? Do they allow you to do that? Like the students to, be you for real, or are you, doing this as an academic straight up?
Well, again, it depends on the class, right? So, but I do tend to have a teaching style where, I will say as a philosopher, my job is to question your assumptions and to pose arguments and this kind of thing. So I like to be sort of somewhat unpredictable. But around things where I'm writing and I have scholarship, I will tell them, here's what I'm thinking. Tell me what's wrong with this or what have you. In terms of the violence piece, the kinds of, I mean, not all my students have seen combat, first of all. So I would say maybe 50-60%, right? Um, so that's one piece. The other piece is that they come having been in a deployment operational cycle where they don't have a chance to catch their breath because of the operational tempo that our military and CIA and these government agencies are under, right? State Department. And so their time at the War College is a chance to take a breath and to reflect on their experiences. So a lot of my students want to take a breath and they've been through some stuff and they want to think about it. So last year, the first day of leadership and profession of arms was the Monday after we withdrew from Afghanistan. And I walked in, the first lesson for leadership and profession of arms is on the profession of arms. And we had just, what are the moral obligations of the profession? We just pulled out of Afghanistan. And we were basically processing moral injury first day of class as we were going, right? Because we had students who, had been there, still had connections. We're trying to get people out. So like sometimes there's that kind of craziness, but the students in general, I think they understand their War College time as a time to step back and think about some of this stuff that they've been through or that they've experienced, but they haven't had a chance to process. They haven't had a chance to think about, what does this mean? So then it's more about them and less about me. So I'm more of a cat herder, and trying to facilitate conversation, which I think is in the Socratic spirit, even if that's not how Socrates actually rolled, right? That my job is to set up some guardrails, to pose some questions, and then to kind of see where things go. And they don't always go where I think they're going to go, and that's fine, because the point is the discussion and their conversations with each other too, because they're peers, right?
Right.
In a significant way that a classroom at an undergraduate institution where you got freshmen and seniors and different majors in the same room, they're kind of peers, but not in the same way that so my leadership profession of arms, I teach the senior class. They're all at the same level, right? Different, it's joint, so they're Marines and Navy and Army and civilians, but they're at the same sort of level of their careers, right? So it's also, the conversation is about their conversation with each other, and I'm just kind of there to poke and guide. And there are times when like discussions going one way and I'm like, have you thought about this? Or when I want to push back a little bit, but sometimes I also just have questions, since this is what I do for a living, research military ethics. So it's a good chance to just have conversations with people who've been there and done that, which obviously I haven't. So it kind of depends on the context, but they bring a lot of experience to the room. So part of the syllabus is them processing that experience, them thinking about their experience of their career so far and where they're going next, and whatever crazy stuff's happening out in the world.
That's always been my favorite academic space, is that sort of the creating academic space for adults who are not processing, oh, I'll be in this career or I'll do this someday, but it's, I just got through doing all this, and I would have been great if I'd have known this stuff then.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fun job. But there are days like last year after the Afghanistan withdrawal, I was really glad that I did work on moral injury, and I could sort of navigate that. Some of my colleagues did not have that background, and it was a challenge. Or, after the week after January 6th, going back to that LPA class and saying, okay, let's talk about civ mil relations and the moral obligations of the profession, and let's try to process this weird thing that's happening in our national life. So, but it's also about understanding, I think, like your conversations, sometimes it's a learning moment, a teaching moment, and it's important, I think, to take on those tough conversations. So my class this week, we got into some stuff on, identity and race and gender. And, one of the students remarked that on each other's faces, they saw excitement for some people and sheer terror from other people. And I was like, yeah, that's what we do here. Right. But it's creating that space where, okay, that question came up, let's go for it. But that also requires, as you know, some expertise, right? And some practice and some skills to make sure that's not an abusive situation, and that it actually becomes a learning moment.
Well, it was fascinating when my one experience at the Naval War College 25 years ago or so, when they brought me in to do a seminar, because I was the only comedian rhetorician they could find for the Strategic Studies Institute, which I don't think is around anymore.
I don't think it's around anymore, but.
Yeah. But the day, spending a day with those guys and all the different commanders that they'd brought in from different branches, and realizing, like, what it finally boiled down to was a discussion of, is it possible basically to drop words on people instead of bombs? Like, how much work can you do with really well-designed rhetoric versus having to go in and use violence? And maybe they work in tandem.
Yeah.
Many times it's like, oh, we are going to continue to do this unless you
and
you find a lot of that interplay with threat and promise of cessation, and all these things that rhetoric gets involved in with the military and with violence. And it was a super fun day talking to them about that.
Yeah, this week, one of the things that was coming up a lot for the leadership class was students thinking about communication generally, like, and how they communicate with their peers and how they're going to communicate with the people that they lead, especially sort of much younger people, so Gen Z and people even younger. So this idea of communication, and that communication is an important part of what they're doing and what they will be doing as a leadership skill is, it was interesting. I mean, it's something that sort of comes up usually, but it, for some reason this year, really came up really early, and really a lot of them are struggling with that, and trying to think about, what does communication look like, with social media, with political polarization, all of these things going on, and the generational shifts. They, think there's an awareness of that too. So absolutely interesting.
Well, cool. I knew it'd be another fun discussion. It was an hour and 25 minutes like that.
Yeah, I know it goes too fast, but thank you so much. And thank you for letting me ask you questions.
Yeah, I think we both like to talk about the things we find interesting. So
yeah, very cool. So appreciate the time, and yeah, good luck with your work. I think it's important work, engaging people in dialogue, and
well, that's all you can really do eventually, right? Like you said, give them the tools, hope they use them, heighten them, and apply them in ways that make things better. That would be the best outcome.
That would be the hope, but it's like gardening. You plant seeds, pull out some weeds, and you never know what's gonna bloom. And I get emails from my former undergraduates all the time, and it's never the students that you think you would be getting letters from. Like, didn't have you pegged for this, which is great.
Right.
It just goes to show that you don't have control, and so you just have to do the best you can, and water the garden and tend the garden and see what blooms, and hope at the end of the day it's good stuff.
Well, any place people can go and buy your books, any place you want to send them, or to your blog, or
Just yeah, send some to my blog or the On Obedience book, because I could always use more shoes, which is on Amazon, or the U.S. Naval Institute press sites. But either of those things would be lovely.
Awesome. Well,
Thanks.
thanks again for popping on.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. And yeah, we'll see you around.
Okay, that has been the rhetoric of violence. Get out there and persuade some people. As always, they need it.